Late swap is a key part of strategy in all DFS sports, but if you are only late swapping your baseball DFS lineups when you have a player that got ruled out in your lineups, you are leaving money on the table and swapping suboptimally. In this video, I'll walk through exactly why late swap is important in MLB DFS and explain what you need from your DFS optimizer to do it correctly. But make sure to stick around until the end of this video, where I'll give you a step-by-step plan you can follow to perfectly late swap your next MLB slate. Now, to start, why is late swap so important in baseball DFS? Well, the answer here is obviously players getting scratched or ending up not in the confirmed starting lineup, or games getting postponed due to weather. All of these things mean that we would be taking a 0 in our lineups, and we clearly don't want to do that, and removing those out players from our lineups is the most fundamental level of late swap. And while these lineups come out earlier in MLB than something like NBA, there are still semi-frequent late scratches and late West Coast games confirmed starting lineups that you have to contend with, making late swap something you'll want to be thinking about when you are playing baseball DFS. And at this first level of late swap, you'll just want to be removing players who are not playing baseball that night from your lineups. But these players getting ruled out of a game can also change the projections of other players playing in the game, and sometimes the dynamics of the slate as a whole if the impact of that player is significant enough. Again, this is a bigger deal in a sport like NBA. Honestly, it's almost the entire strategy of NBA DFS, but a key hitter on a team getting scratched can affect the projections of the other hitters on the team or the opposing pitcher, and pitcher scratchers in particular can be very impactful to the way that a game is projected. And this is what I call the second level of late swap in MLB. And in this case, we might want to be swapping our lineups even if we don't have players that got ruled out. If an ace pitcher gets scratched and suddenly a team is hitting against a weak bullpen all game, or if the best hitter on a team is not in the confirmed starting lineup and their team total drops accordingly, we might want to adjust a bunch of our different lineups to account for that news, not just the lineups with the player that got ruled out. But the reason to late swap your MLB DFS lineups that the majority of the field completely overlooks is to account for the live information that we gain as the slate plays out in real time. We gain this information as a slate plays out about what players are actually doing in the baseball games, as well as their ownership in our DFS contests. And we can use that information to make the best possible decisions for the remaining players in our lineups. At lock, each player has a different possible range of outcomes of what could happen on that slate. The range of outcomes goes from their bottom floor outcomes, scoring 0, all the way to their top end ceiling. But as these games actually play out, those outcomes narrow more and more and more until they converge on whatever the player's final fantasy points are at the end of the game. And while we can't remove or add players whose games have already started from our lineups, this information gives us a better understanding of what lineups that contain those players need to maximize their profit potential for the rest of the slate. For example, your lineup with a low-owned stack that is crushing through 5 innings might be able to maximize the potential of a takedown by swapping the rest of the lineup into chalkier, higher projected players. Your lineup that's struggling and underperforming expectations might be able to swap back into some min cashing potential by swapping into some very low owned plays and just hoping that they get there at low ownership. And there's a similar effect here with the actual ownership projections, or more specifically, the actual lineups that you're competing against in your contests. Pre-lock, we have to make an educated guess on how the entire field in your contest will play, based on projections, salaries, and so on. But as soon as some of these games lock, we know what a portion of the field is playing exactly. Not only do we know the real ownership projections of players in games in progress, but we start to get a sense of what the literal lineups you're competing against are. For example, we might know 5 of the 10 players already locked into a given lineup, and now it's much easier to predict what the remaining 5 players could be and what that lineup you're actually facing looks like. With this info, we can refine our decisions we made about game theory and ownership decisions before lock with more accurate information about what your opponents are actually playing. If we tried to play a low-owned stack, and they ended up coming in higher owned than expected, we might want to swap to lower owned plays in the rest of the lineup the rest of the way to make sure that we're still contrarian enough to win. And if we played a high projected pitcher that we expected to be extremely popular and he's not as chalky as expected, we might be able to swap into higher owned, better projected hitters in the rest of the lineup. We get increasingly more accurate about both the player fantasy point range of potential outcomes and the lineups that our opponents are actually playing against us as the slate is going on. And we can constantly apply that information to late swaps as each game on the slate locks to maximize our EV. Now, there are a lot of potentially competing factors here. When navigating late swap for an MLB slate, you need to be quickly adjusting projections based on starting lineups and player scratches. You need to be rebuilding your lineups to account for this information while maintaining the correlation and stacks that you know you need in your lineups to win. And you should be reacting to the information that you have now that you didn't have at lock about how your lineups and your opponent's lineups are performing so far. SaberSim solves this challenge directly with live simulations. We kick off new play-by-play game simulations for games as starting lineups and player scratches are confirmed, accounting for how which players are in and out affects the range of outcomes of the game. And as games lock, we update our field lineups used in our contest sims and those that power our ownership projections based on the actual lineups your opponents are playing in your contests on DraftKings. And as games play out on the field, we run a new simulation of the game every half inning from that point in the game onward to get an accurate sense of what the true range of outcomes is for each player playing in that game. When you run late swap builds on SaberSim, we take each original lineup you played in your contest and create dozens of new potential swap options for each lineup that you entered at lock. And our contest sims will use the live information from games in progress to simulate out how each potential swap would perform in the remainder of the slate if it played out 100,000 times, letting you identify the most positive expected value swaps that you can swap your lineups to. But you need a plan of attack for how to do this effectively during a baseball slate. If you were solely focused on maximizing lineup EV at all times, it would be optimal to late swap and rebuild your lineups before the start of every single game. You'd be readjusting for live ownership at every step and be incorporating the live simulations and updated player ranges of outcomes at every swap opportunity. Honestly, if you're playing MLB DFS as a professional or a semi-pro, counting on this as a legitimate income source, you probably should be swapping at every opportunity to capitalize on this edge. But we're not all pros, and not all of us can or want to be spending every night of the summer swapping MLB DFS lineups every half hour. So what is a good balance where you can get the majority of the value here while minimizing the time investment required? Here's what I do and what I recommend as a strong balance. I'll walk through how to actually do this in SaberSim in just a minute, but here's the fundamental process. First, pay attention to news and notifications, and always make sure to quickly swap players that are out of your lineups completely. And then anytime you have an out player that was in your lineups, you should be running a new late swap build and a contest sim after you've gotten those players out of your lineups. Outside of those mandatory swaps to get players that are going to give you a 0 out of your lineups, you should also shoot for an additional late swap about halfway through the slate. And this additional late swap is more focused on capturing live data, and doing this is a bit of a balancing act, which is why I like to shoot for the halfway point in the slate. Towards the end of the slate, we have the maximum amount of information available, but the least ability to act on that information. Because most of our lineups will have the majority of their players locked up, and we don't have many games with players left to swap to, we don't have a lot of outs to change the EV of our lineups. While we know a lot about how the early games ended up going and what all the ownership looked like for all the games that I've already locked, we just don't have a lot of ability to do anything with our swaps. On the flip side, early in the slate, we have a ton of these swap options available, but we have more limited information. We have a ton of flexibility to make changes to our lineups, but not a lot of information has changed that makes us want to do it, apart from maybe changing starting lineups or scratches if we've gotten any of that information already. Swapping very early in the slate is a lot like just rebuilding your lineups like you did at lock, with maybe some additional small information about ownership in those early games. And this is why I like the halfway point of the slate as a good middle ground. And when I say halfway point, I really mean by the number of games, not from a timing standpoint. So on a 10-game slate, I see the halfway point as being when the 6th game is about to start. At this point, we have a nice middle ground of having some solid, actionable info from the early games, but we still have a lot of potential flexibility to swap players in and out from the remaining games on the slate. So let's go ahead and hop into the SaberSim app, and I'll actually walk through what this looks like in practice for me. Now, first things first, I recommend turning your desktop notifications on. This will send you an alert to your computer anytime a player that has been ruled out is in your entries file on SaberSim to let you know to get them out of your lineups. Now, this should be on by default, but if it's not, and you can double check here in the upper right with this little notification bell, you'll see the notification center, which will show any notifications that are currently going on for that slate. And if you just hit this gear icon, you can look at your alert preferences. You want to make sure that at least players out/0 projections is toggled on. This will make sure we're sending an alert to your computer anytime a player is out that is in your entries file. And if you also want to add this for mobile notifications to get a notification to your smartphone if a player is out, there is an additional video that you can find on our support by clicking this link. I don't want to go and re-record that video necessarily right now in this one, so click that link if you want to see how to get notifications on your phone, but at the very least, the desktop notifications are really helpful. If you're entering your lineups, you're going to be around your computer doing other things, you can get a notification when you need to make a swap. Now, if you get a notification saying a player is out, or if you just come back to check out the app later, in the SaberSim app, the main thing you want to look for first is this quick swap icon, this lightning bolt icon in the upper left. When this icon turns red, it means that you have a player in your entries file that has since been ruled out, and you will want to act immediately to fix that before doing anything else. So I can mimic this here by turning a player that is in my entries file to a 0 projection, and when we click this, we'll get a summary of the players that have since been ruled out. Now, I like to look at this here and kind of figure out what the particular player is and what it means in my lineups. If it is a hitter that has been ruled out, my general practice here is to first attempt to swap from the best from the same team, and then do any remaining swaps to the best available players. So let me go ahead here and instead find a player that is in a lot of my lineups that is a hitter here, so I can show you what this looks like. So let's say Christian Yelich ends up getting ruled out, who has been hurt a lot this year, has missed some games. He gets ruled out. Now I click this and it's letting me know Yelich is out. The way I would handle this exact situation is to first just quick swap them from players from the best available team. And in this case, we were able to fill all 70 with other Brewers players. And I like this because I know most of the time Yelich is going to be showing up in my lineups with other Brewers. So even if sometimes he's used as a one-off and we end up plugging one of these guys in, that's okay. The main thing I want to make sure is that most of my Brewer stacks where Yelich is likely to be in there are still intact. Sometimes you will see a message here where it's saying that some of the lineups could not be swapped. You were not able to swap to a different player. In that case, you can then change to best available and do an additional swap here to swap the remaining lineups to any other well-projected hitter, a player that fits into that position and in that salary range. If it is a pitcher that has gotten ruled out, I will just instead swap them to the best available player. I don't care about swapping pitchers to the same team. I just want the next best pitcher up. And all we're doing here is preventing us from taking a 0. This takes like 5 seconds to do when you're actually trying to handle this quickly here. Once we've done the swaps, we can just click download entries. We have a new entries file we can get uploaded to DraftKings in just a few seconds. Again, the rest of the process of late swapping can take a few minutes to get done. This is a 5-second, 10-second or less approach that just makes sure we're never taking zeros in our lineups, which is, again, the most important first level of baseball DFS. Now, after we've removed these players that are out, and really anytime we have to do this process, we also want to be running a late swap build. Now, a late swap build is going to take all of our lineups that we have right now and create new swap options for them. It's going to lock in the players who are already started in their games in those lineups, then remove all the other players that are in those lineups here whose games have not started, and rebuild new options for each lineup in your pool. The reason we want to do this is, again, for that second level of late swap strategy. These players getting ruled out can affect the context of the slate, and we want to make sure that we are reacting accordingly. if Christian Yelich actually gets ruled out, well, the first thing we want to do is make sure we're getting those Brewers, we're getting a new Brewer into as many of those lineups as possible, or we're getting a new well-projected pitch hitter into those lineups where we can. But that also may change the way we think about Brewers overall. So we want to run a late swap build. So to do that, we'll click the button right next to the quick swap here, the late swap button. This will ask us what contests we want to late swap. I typically recommend just grouping all of your contests together and late swapping them all at once for time reasons. And then we'll click late swap contest here. This basically brings you back to the same kind of page that you would have seen when you were building your lineups before lock. At this point, we can just go ahead here, make again 2 changes to player projections so that we're abiding by DraftKings rules here. And then I recommend making swaps per lineup as large as possible, depending on how many original lineups you played. So what this is saying is each of my 150 lineups that I originally played here, we're going to get 33 different options for what that lineup could become. Now we'll click build lineups. And if this were a real late swap, we would be taking the new simulations for that Brewers game, but also for any other confirmed starting lineups we have since gotten here, and rebuilding these lineups around those new simulations and those new projections. Okay, now after this late swap build is complete, we can do the most powerful part here, which is running the contest sim. So if you run a contest sim before lock, you'll probably just have these settings already configured here. But in the contest sim settings, if we open this up, you'll see 2 toggles. One, use live sims if available, and use live field lineups if available. Now, if this were a real late swap, if this slate was going on right now, we would be for all the games in progress, instead of using their original projections, using the in-game simulation. So if a game is in the top of the 4th inning, we're adjusting those players who might be in your lineups. We're adjusting their ranges of outcomes based on the top of the 4th inning and on sims. We're also using the live field lineups here if available. So for your particular contest, again, this is specific to DraftKings here, we're actually taking the lineups that you are competing against in the Minimax and what we know about those lineups so far, rebuilding those lineups to try to figure out what they could potentially be, what other players might be in those lineups there, and competing your swap options in a simulated version of the contest from this point on, both the games on the baseball diamond, the actual baseball games being played, and the potential lineups your opponents might be playing in your contest. So instead of this being like a contest sim we run before lock, where we're making predictions about the entire full range of outcomes of the game and the entire field that you're competing against, we're now incorporating the information we know, what has happened in the baseball game so far, and what players are locked into the lineups your opponents are playing to give you a more accurate contest sim. So this is already configured automatically, and it will be configured this way if you've run a contest sim before lock. We just now want to contest sim our late swap options here. And once that contest sim is done, all we want to do again is once again sort by the risk-adjusted ROI here of our lineups to find the most optimal swaps we can make. At this point in the process, you will tend to see different numbers here than what you saw at lock. You might be seeing some lineups that have a very high potential ROI. If those lineups are overperforming their original expectation, you might also start to see lineups down closer to the bottom that are expected to be negative ROI or fighting for a min cash or something like that if you have lineups that are underperforming their expectation. But by sorting by the risk-adjusted ROI, we're identifying the best possible swap we can make for each of our lineups for the rest of the slate. Now, it is at this point in the process where you can make other adjustments here, whether you like to diversify with min uniques, which is something I tend to do. I like to keep my min uniques at the same value I had before lock. And if you want to take any new stands by adjusting min or max exposure here, you can do so. But keep in mind, a lot of times you're under somewhat of a time crunch here, so I wouldn't plan to make a ton of adjustments in your late swap builds. I most of the time let the contest sim handle a lot of this value for me and just focus on getting these lineups updated. And to do that, at this step, all we need to do is click Save to My Contests, refill these lineups here, and then download selected entries and get them back uploaded to DraftKings. Now to summarize here, here's my overall late swap strategy. The first thing you want to be doing is paying attention to news and your notifications and making sure that you're removing players that are not playing baseball that night from your lineups. You can do that very easily with the quick swap icon up here in the upper left. Anytime this turns red, you need to get a player that's out of your lineups. out. Anytime you do that, you also then want to be running a late swap build. This will account for that second level of late swap strategy, where you are rebuilding your lineups to account for the new projections of players in those games where a player has been scratched or is not going to play baseball that night. When you do that, you also can run a contest sim, which is going to account for the live information that has happened in the slate so far, whether that is how players are actually performing in the baseball games or how your opponents are playing in your DFS contests. And I recommend running one additional late swap at around the halfway point of the slate. This is a good balance between having information from early games, but also still having enough that you can do in later games to account for that information. For this slate tonight, for example, this is an 11 or so game slate. I would probably target a late swap. Maybe this is a little tight because there's 6:05 games starting here and then 6:10 games. I don't know if we're going to be able to swap in this window perfectly. So I would probably try to swap maybe at around 6:20 here with 4 games remaining on the slate and 7 that have already started. That's a pretty nice balance here between those two. You could also sneak in an additional late swap maybe after the 5:20 games have started here, the 5 o'clock games, and get one in before the 6 o'clock games start and find another break point here. That might be another way to balance this. Those are purely about capturing that live information we're getting before lock and incorporating it into our lineups. Those ones we don't necessarily need a player that is out to run that late swap and account for that live information. Having a tool like SaberSim that can help you efficiently pilot your lineups through these swap situations, as well as a plan of attack of how you're going to use it for your next slate, is a game changer for your MLB DFS strategy. This system I've outlined in this video has been the perfect approach for me this season, and I highly recommend using it on your next MLB DFS slate. Now, as I mentioned at the start of this video, one of the main reasons in baseball that I find myself back at my computer to run a late swap build is for weather postponements. And navigating this weather risk in MLB DFS is a part of the game that really requires an entire strategy of its own. So next up, check out my guide to MLB DFS weather and make sure to subscribe so you never miss one of my videos. I'll see you in the next one.